So this is the federal government and the states potentially investing on a proprietary basis in digital assets.
This is kind of the golden Fort Knox, having this strategic reserve of assets. Hello and welcome to LathamTECH Podcast. What are companies on your side of the Atlantic thinking about now? What are their biggest concerns?
We have seen the first fully comprehensive crypto assets regulatory regime be released in the EU with the MiCA regime. What do companies do in this interim state when they want to try and launch in the US or expand their businesses in the US?
Nothing has really been changed substantively. Certainly the risk level overall has decreased. What I think it's important for is kind of establishing the value of these assets in the broader marketplace and in broader American life.